They said afterward that the room had never been so quiet, that even the fire seemed to hold its breath in the grate, and that the only sound in the whole of the long dining hall at Aldermere was the small, domestic, unbearable sound of water moving in a basin. It was the last week of October, and the frost had come early that year, silvering the lawns and stiffening the last of the roses along the south wall, and the guests who had gathered at the Duke's table had come in furs and had not yet quite got warm, so that the cold outside was a presence in the room, a thing everyone was privately aware of, which is perhaps why it took a moment for the words to be understood for what they were. The Duke of Aldermere set down his glass, and looked not at his wife, but at the woman seated in the place of honour at his right hand, and said, in the flat, even, unhurried voice of a man asking for the salt, "Wash the mistress's feet tonight." He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. A man who owns the roof and the walls and the very candles that light a room has no need to raise his voice. And the particular cruelty of a quiet order given at a full table is that everyone hears it, and no one is permitted to have heard it. So that 14 well-bred people found something urgent to examine in their plates. Eleanor, Duchess of Aldermere, did not find anything urgent in her plate. She had been trained over 3 years of a marriage that had asked a great deal of her and offered very little, in the discipline of the untroubled face, and she wore it now as another woman might wear a shawl against a draught, drawn close, giving nothing away. She looked at her husband for the length of one held breath. Then she rose. The woman at the Duke's right hand was Camilla, Lady Wren, widowed these 2 years and returned to the county in the spring like a season that had been expected, and she had the kind of beauty that is aware of itself and finds the awareness charming. And she laughed a small laugh, low in her throat, and said that really it was too much. Her feet were merely cold from the carriage. She had not meant to make anyone go to any trouble. But she did not withdraw the offer. She let it stand there in the middle of the table, warming her hands at the fire of it, and she watched the Duchess cross the room with the same pleasant, patient attention with which one watches a servant one is thinking of dismissing. A footman was sent for the basin. He came back with it too quickly, which meant it had been made ready in advance, which meant the whole of it had been arranged before the soup was cold, and Eleanor understood this the way she understood a column of figures that would not balance, seeing at once the entry that had been made and could not now be unmade. If she had wept, they would have forgiven him, for a weeping woman is a woman who has been wronged, and everyone knows what to do with her. She did not weep. She knelt on the cold flags in her good silk, the one gown she had bought for herself in 3 years, and she took Lady Wren's narrow mocking foot in her 2 hands, and she washed it as though it were the most ordinary task in the world, as though she had been born to do nothing else. And the water was very cold, and the room was very quiet, and no one at that table would ever forget it, though most of them spent the rest of their lives pretending they had. If you have ever been made small in a room full of people who chose that exact moment to study the tablecloth, if you have ever been handed a humiliation so quietly wrapped that to object to it would have been to make the scene yourself, then you already know the thing that Eleanor knew as she knelt there, which is that the cruelty was never the water and never the feet, but the silence of the people who might have spoken and did not, chief among them the man who had made vows to her in a cold chapel 3 winters before. And if this story stirs something in you, some old memory of a table you sat at and were made to feel a guest at in your own life, then say so where you are watching from, and stay with her a while, because I promise you the water in the basin is not where this ends. She washed the one foot, and then, because she had been told the mistress's feet and a plural is a plural, she washed the other, slowly, thoroughly, giving the task the whole of the dignity that the room had tried to take from her, so that by the end it was not clear at all who in that hall had been diminished and who had not. Lady Wren's laugh had gone somewhere and not come back. The Duke was looking at the fire. When it was done, Eleanor set the mistress's feet down gently on the warmed cloth that had been laid for them, as one sets down something borrowed, and she rose, and she dried her hands on the towel a footman held out to her with his eyes fixed hard on the wall, and she did not curtsy, because a curtsy is a word, and she had decided she would say nothing at all. She looked once more at her husband, who did not look back. Then she walked the length of the hall and out through the door, and the door made almost no sound as it closed, and afterward the household would remember that it was the quietness of that door, and not any slamming of it, that told them the marriage was over. She went up to her rooms, and she did not ring for her maid. She stood for a moment at the window with her cold hands pressed flat against the colder glass, looking down at the drive where the frost lay unbroken and blew under a low hard moon, and she permitted herself exactly one thing, which was to let her forehead rest against the pane for the space of 10 slow breaths. And no one saw it. And it was the only time in the whole of that night that Eleanor of Aldermary came close to breaking, and she did not break. Then she straightened. She took off the good silk gown, folded it, and left it lying across the chair, because it had been bought for a life she was finished with, and she would not carry it into the next one. She dressed instead in the plain grey wool she had worn on the day she married, which had been her mother's. And she put on her stoutest boots, the ones with the double soles that her father had ordered for her the last winter he had money to order anything. And she took down from the top of the press a small leather case, the only thing she meant to carry away, in which were 3 things: a bundle of letters, a worn book of accounts in her own hand, and a length of drainage plan for the low meadows, drawn in her own careful ink, and never once shown to the man who owned the meadows. She did not take her jewels. She did not take the pearls he had given her on the morning after the wedding without meeting her eyes, nor the ring, which she left in the small dish on the dressing-table, where it caught the last of the candlelight, and then, when she pinched the candle out, caught nothing at all. There was a carriage. Of course there was a carriage. The Duke of Aldermary kept 4, and a word to the stables would have brought 1 round within the quarter hour, warmed with hot bricks and a driver in livery. And by every custom and expectation of her rank the Duchess should have left, if she must leave, as a duchess leaves, wheeled away into the dark behind a pair of matched greys. Eleanor thought about the carriage. She stood at the top of the servants' stair with her case in her hand, and she considered the warm, easy, invisible thing that a carriage would have been, the way it would have carried her off still wrapped in the last of his consequence, still in some small degree his, and she decided against it. She went down the back stair and out through the scullery door, past a scullery maid who dropped a pan and then pretended, wisely, to have seen nothing at all, and she walked out into the freezing October night, on her own 2 feet, down the long gravel drive that the household would grit against the frost by morning, past the dark lodge and through the iron gates that stood open, because no one, had thought to close them against a woman leaving, and she turned onto the county road and kept walking. It was 4 miles to the market town and the mail coach that left it before dawn. She had washed the mistress's feet with those 2 hands, and now she carried herself away on those 2 feet, and there was in this a symmetry so exact that she almost smiled at it. Alone on the road in the cold, though she did not quite, the moon went behind a cloud and came out again. The frost crunched under the double soles of her boots. Behind her the great house sat blazing with the light of a party that had not yet understood it was over, and she did not once look back at it, and the last of Aldemir she took with her was the sound of her own steady footsteps going away. To understand how a marriage arrives at a basin of cold water, you must go back 3 years and a little more to a merchant's counting house in the city that smelled of tar and sealing wax and the river, where Eleanor Prentice had learned the whole of what she knew, which was a great deal, at the elbow of her father Josiah, who dealt in cargoes out of the eastern ports, and who had told her, when she was 9 years old and had corrected his clerk's addition, that God had made her for figures, and it was a pity and a waste that he had also made her a girl. She had run his books by the time she was 17. She knew the price of things, the true price, the price under the price, the way a bad debt hides itself in a good ledger, and the way a sound man's affairs can be brought down not by his own folly, but by the folly of the men he has trusted, which was precisely how her father was brought down in the winter of her 20th year, when a partner sailed for the Indies with the firm's capital and 3 of the firm's ships, and left Josiah Prentice, a bankrupt with a daughter, a good name, suddenly worth nothing, and a debt owed to, among a dozen creditors, the estate of the young Duke of Aldemir, whose late father had unwisely put money into Eastern shipping, and whose son was now trying, coldly and methodically, to get it back out. It is worth saying plainly what a bankruptcy did to a family in those years, because we are gentle now with the language of ruin and they were not, and Eleanor watched her father go in a single season from a man whom other men rose for when he entered a room to a man they crossed the street to avoid. Watched the clerks let go, one by one. Watched the good furniture carried out by men who did not trouble to be careful with it, and learned at 20 the lesson that a person's worth in the world is a thing the world can revalue overnight and without notice, which is a hard lesson but not a wholly bad one, for it left her, ever after, entirely free of the fear of falling, having already fallen and found that the ground was there. The Duke came himself to the counting-house, which no one expected, dukes not being in the habit of calling on their bankrupts, and he found there not the broken old merchant he had come to press, but the merchant's daughter, who received him with an untroubled face and a full accounting of the estate laid open on the desk, showing him to the penny what could be recovered and what could not, and what the honest recovery of it would cost in men thrown out of work, and what a patient recovery might yield instead if he were willing to wait 2 years for it. He had come expecting to despise them. He stayed 3 hours. The proposal that came a month later was put to Josiah Prentice as a business arrangement, and understood by everyone concerned as exactly that. The Duke would settle the firm's debts and provide for the old man's last years, and in exchange he would take the daughter, who would bring to Aldemir no dowry but the one thing the estate desperately needed, and the Duke would never once, in 3 years, admit aloud that it needed, which was someone who understood money. It was a marriage of convenience so plainly that neither of them insulted the other by pretending otherwise, and Eleanor accepted it with her eyes open, for her father's sake and for the roof it put over his head, and she told herself she expected nothing. And she almost meant it. The Duke's coldness had a history, as all such coldness does, and the history was this. His mother, the old duchess, had been a warm and open woman who had loved her husband plainly, and had been repaid for it by watching him install a mistress in the county and seat her, at more than one public dinner, in the chair that should have been the duchess's own. So that the boy Julian had grown up learning, in the most thorough school there is, that to love openly is to hand another person the exact instrument of your humiliation, and that a wife who is seen to feel is a wife who can be made to suffer in front of everyone she knows. His mother had died of it, not quickly and not dramatically, but the way a fire dies when no one feeds it, going quieter each year until one winter she was simply gone. And there had been, later, a girl he had loved as young men love, recklessly and with his whole face showing, and her name was Camilla. And she had thrown him over for a richer and older man, with a title 1 degree higher than his own, and had done it, moreover, with a laugh, in company, so that the wound was not only that she left, but that everyone had watched her leave. He had folded these two lessons into a single hard policy, and had governed himself by it ever since, that he would never again let it be seen that he wanted anything, least of all a woman, and that the way to be safe was to keep the person nearest you at a temperature just above freezing, warm enough to keep, cold enough that its loss could cost you nothing. He had married a woman who understood ledgers, and he had ruled her by the same principle by which he ruled his tenants, and he had never once let her see that he had begun, against every rule he had made for himself, to look forward to the evenings when she went over the accounts. He would find reasons to be in the library at the hour she worked there. He told himself it was the fire, or the light, or a paper he needed, and he sat with a book he did not read and watched, over the top of it, the particular stillness of a woman absorbed in a difficult sum. The way her lips moved very slightly when she carried a figure, the way she would sit back when a column at last agreed with her and allow herself, alone as she believed herself to be, one small private smile of satisfaction that she showed to no one, that was for the numbers only, and that he came to want with an intensity that alarmed him to be shown. He never asked to be shown it. To ask would have been to admit that he wanted it, and to want, he had decided long ago, was to hand the whole of himself to another person's keeping, and he had seen, in that very house, at that very table, what people did with a thing that had been handed to them, and so he kept his silence and kept his coat buttoned, and kept his wife at the careful temperature of a room one does not quite heat, and told himself it was safety, and did not call it by its truer name, which was fear. For it must be said, because it is the truest and the saddest part of the whole business, that Eleanor had not been unhappy at Aldermary, or rather that she had begun in the 3rd year to be in danger of happiness, which is a different and more perilous thing. She had made herself useful in the quiet, invisible way that had always been her genius. She had gone through the estate's affairs the way she had gone through her father's, and had found them in the condition of a good house with a leaking roof, sound in the main timbers and rotting quietly at the edges, and she had set about the repair without asking permission. Because asking permission was not the arrangement. She had found that the home farm was carried at a loss that no one had troubled to notice, that the drainage of the low meadows had been bungled by a surveyor who was paid by the day and therefore in no hurry, that the steward, an honest man named Hollis, had been fighting a losing war against the household's expenses with no one behind him, and that 100 small sums were leaking out of the estate through the ordinary carelessness of people who had never had to count. She had stopped the leaks one by one. She did it at night, at the little desk in her sitting room, in a ledger she kept in her own hand, and she left her conclusions where Hollis would find them. And Hollis, who was no fool, had begun to bring her the difficult things directly, and to speak of her below stairs, in the dry, sparing, entirely serious way that was the highest praise that man possessed, saying only that her grace had a head on her, which from Hollis was a coronation. And there had been the beginnings of something between Eleanor and the man she had married. Small green things pushing up through frozen ground, so faint that she had been afraid to look at them directly for fear of finding she had imagined them. There was the book. She had left a book of essays on the window seat in the library, half-read, and had come back to find it moved to the small table by her chair with a strip of paper marking a page she had not reached. And when she read that page, she found a passage on the management of woodland underlined in pencil, faintly, by a hand that was not her own, as though someone had wanted her to see it, and had not wanted to be seen wanting it. There was the matter of the low meadows when the Duke had said, over dinner and apropos of nothing, that he had been thinking they ought to look into the drainage down there, using the word we, saying we ought to look into it, and she had kept her face still, and her heart had done something foolish. There was the morning he had ridden out early and come back with a spray of the year's first hedge roses laid, without a word, beside her plate, and had then behaved for the rest of the day as though roses grew on plates as a matter of course and no comment was required. She had let herself hope. That was the thing she could not forgive herself for later, kneeling on the flags. Not that he had ordered her to wash another woman's feet, but that she had let herself believe, in the weeks before he did it, that he had begun to see her, so that when he showed the whole county that he had not, or would not, or dared not, the wound went in not at the surface, but all the way down to the exact place where the hope had been, and killed it, which was, she came to understand, precisely what it had been designed to do. Camilla had come back widowed in the spring, and the old wound in him had opened. And he had reached for the old cold policy the way a frightened man reaches for a weapon he knows, and he had used his wife to prove to himself and to Camilla and to the county that Julian of Aldermary wanted nothing and could be hurt by no one. He had bought the proof with the one thing in his house that had begun, without his leave, to matter to him, and he had not understood the price of it until the house went quiet. The house went quiet the way a clock goes quiet when it stops, which is to say that no one notices the sound until it is gone, and then can hear nothing else. For the first day the Duke told himself, and told the 2 or 3 people who dared to raise the matter, that the Duchess had gone to visit her father's people and would return when she had recovered her temper. And he said the word temper with a small contemptuous emphasis meant to close the subject, though Eleanor had not in 3 years been observed by anyone to have a temper, which was rather the difficulty. By the second day the word temper had stopped working, even on himself. By the end of the first week, the machinery of the great house, which had run so smoothly that he had believed it ran itself, began to make the small ugly noises of a mechanism from which someone has quietly removed the mainspring. A tradesman's bill was paid twice. A quarter's accounts came due, and no one could find the working papers, until Hollis produced them, and the Duke, sitting down to read them, discovered that he could not. He understood the figures well enough. What he could not read was the shape behind them, the reasoning, the dozens of small decisions by which a loss had been turned toward a profit, and it was then, going through the estate ledgers in search of the sense he could not supply himself, that he came upon her hand. Her marginalia were everywhere, once he learned to see them. A fine small pencil in the margins of the great leather books, and he found himself reading them the way another man might read a letter from a woman he loved, which he did not, he told himself, and read on. "Query the mill lease at Leady Day," one note said, and beside it, in the same hand but a different day's ink, "Done, he yielded a shilling, worth it for the goodwill." "Home Farm carried at a loss these 6 years," said another. "The loss is the shepherd's wage, and the shepherd is old. Keep him and call it charity, not farming, and stop pretending it is farming." And in the back of the second volume, folded and tucked and clearly not meant for him or for anyone, a full scheme for the drainage of the low meadows, worked out to the last rod and load, with the cost set against the gain over 10 years and the gain winning, and at the foot of it, in a smaller hand still, as though she had written it to herself late at night and been almost ashamed of it, the words, proposed to him in the spring, when he is easier. He sat with that page a long time. He was a man who had built his whole life on the principle that to want something is to be weak, and he sat in his cold study with a piece of paper on which his wife had planned, in secret, with money she had saved him without his knowledge, to give him a gift, and had been waiting only for a day when he might be kind enough to receive it, and he understood for the first time fully what he had done, and it did not feel like weakness at all. It felt like the floor going out from under a man who had always believed he was standing on stone. He rode out to the low meadows in the rain. He did not know quite why, except that the paper had said them, and he wanted to stand in the place she had cared about, and he stood there in the wet with his horse cropping the sour grass, and he saw that she had been right about all of it. That the water lay in the field exactly where her plan said it lay, that the rushes grew exactly where she had marked the ground as spoiled, and that a woman who had never in her life set eyes on this field until she married him had understood it better than the men who had farmed it for 40 years, because she had troubled to look and to think and to count. He came back soaked and did not change and sat dripping in the library, and he read the pencilled margins again by candlelight, and the thing that undid him was not the cleverness of them, though they were clever, but the tone, the dry, patient, private humour of a woman writing to no audience, keeping herself company over the accounts the way she had kept herself company all her life. And he realised, reading them, that he had lived 3 years in the same house as a whole, warm, particular person, and had made it his settled policy never to find out who she was. That he had, sitting at his own table every evening, a wit and a mind and a private smile, that he had been too much a coward to reach across a foot of mahogany and ask to know, and that she had given all of it, freely and without thanks, to a ledger and an old shepherd and a field of sour grass, because those things, unlike her husband, had been safe to love. It was there that his great-aunt found him, having arrived that afternoon uninvited and unannounced, as she had done all his life, with the particular timing of a woman who considers the discomfort of others to be a summons. Lady Augusta was 71 years old, had buried 2 husbands and outlived most of her enemies, which she counted the chief pleasure of great age, and she possessed the one thing that no amount of a duke's displeasure could take from her, which was the willingness to say to his face the thing that everyone else in the county was saying behind his back. "You look," said Lady Augusta, settling herself by the fire and examining her nephew with frank distaste, "like a man who has drowned a good dog and is only now wondering whether he was fond of it." He said he was in no humour for her. "No," she agreed. "I don't imagine you are. Men in your situation seldom are." She let the fire crackle. Then she asked him, in the pleasant conversational tone in which she asked the most dangerous of her questions, whether it was true, the story that was going round the county, the story about the basin. And he said nothing, which she took, correctly, for a yes. She was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke again, the pleasantness had gone out of her voice and left something older and harder underneath. "I knew your mother," she said. "I watched your father seat that Fairfax woman in her chair at the harvest dinner in front of the whole county, and I watched your mother sit and smile and die of it by inches over 11 years. And I swore to myself I would never see the like again in this family, and I have lived long enough, it seems, to see it done twice. Only this time the man doing it is the boy who watched it done. You did not learn to be cold from strangers, Julian. You learned it in this house, at that table, from the one man on earth you should have been most careful not to become, and you have grown up and put on his very coat." He told her to stop. She did not stop. "She was worth 10 of you," said his great-aunt, "and worth 20 of the wren creature, and the whole county knows it. And the worst of it, the very worst of it, is that I believe you know it too. Which means you did what you did not because you did not value her, but because you did. And it frightened you. And you would rather break a good thing than be seen to hold it. That is not the sin of a hard man. That is the sin of a coward." And then she rose and gathered her shawl and said, more gently, that she would take a little supper in her room, and left him alone with the fire and the truest sentence anyone had said to him in 20 years. But it was not the great-aunt who broke him, in the end, for a grown man can withstand a great deal of truth from another grown person by the simple expedient of resenting the teller. It was the child. The Duke's ward was a small grave girl of 8 named Lucy, the orphaned daughter of a cousin killed in the wars, who had lived at Aldermere for 2 years and had attached herself, quietly and without permission, to the duchess, following her about the estate on her rounds, holding the ends of measuring tapes, being taught her sums at the little desk at night, and being, in the whole of that cold house, the one creature to whom Eleanor had shown the warmth she kept hidden from everyone else. The child had not been told anything. Children never are, and know everything regardless. She had stopped eating properly. She had taken to sitting on the stairs at the hour when the Duchess used to come up. And one evening, finding the Duke alone, she came and stood in front of him in her nightgown, having escaped her nurse, and she looked at him with the unbearable directness of the very young. And she asked him the question that all the adults in the county were too well bred to ask, which was this: did you send her away, or did she leave? He began to say something about how these matters were complicated and not for children. The child waited, unmoving, having heard nothing that answered the question. So he tried again, and found that he could not lie to her, and said, at last, that he had done a cruel thing, and that the Duchess had left because of it. Lucy considered this with great seriousness. "Then you have to bring her back," she said, as though stating a rule of arithmetic, a thing simply true. And when he said that it was not so easy as that a person could not always be brought back, the child said the sentence that he would carry for the rest of his life. "You didn't try to keep her," she said. "You only tried to keep from wanting to." Then she went to bed, and the Duke of Aldemere sat alone in the great cold house and wept, for the first time since his mother's funeral. Because an 8-year-old had said in 11 words the thing that his great-aunt had needed a lifetime and a speech to say, and there was no arguing with it, and no coat cold enough to keep it out. Camilla, Lady Wren, played her hand once more, and it was in the playing of it that the Duke saw at last, with the clean, cold clarity of a man whose fever has broken, exactly what he had thrown away and exactly what he had reached for instead. She had felt the change in the house, as such women always do, and she came to Aldemere to secure her position, arriving on a bright, hard morning in a great deal of fur, and she found the Duke in the library and set herself to the work of reminding him what he had wanted her for. She spoke of the Duchess, when she spoke of her at all, in the tone of gentle regret one uses for an unfortunate servant, saying what a pity it was and how the girl had never really been suited to the position, coming as she did from trade, and how everyone had always known it, and how much easier things would be now, and how well she herself understood the running of a great house, having been mistress of one, and how the county would be so relieved to see Aldemere in proper hands again. And the Duke listened to her, and looked at her, at the beauty that was still real and still aware of itself, and he found, to his own astonishment, that he was comparing her, sentence by sentence, to a woman kneeling on cold flags, and that Camilla was losing. He thought of Eleanor's marginalia. He thought of keep the old shepherd and call it charity. And he looked at the woman across from him who had just called his wife a pity and a piece of trade. And he understood that Camilla did not know the price of anything, had never in her life had to count, and that this, which he had once found charming, the airy expensiveness of her, was in fact a kind of blindness, and that he had nearly organized the rest of his life around it, because it flattered the frightened boy in him who still, after 20 years, wanted the girl who had laughed at him in company to be sorry. "You called her a piece of trade," he said, interrupting Camilla in the middle of a sentence about redecorating the yellow drawing-room. She blinked. He said it again, more quietly, and then he said something that no one at Aldemere had ever heard him say, which was that the woman she called a piece of trade had, in 3 years and without a word of thanks from him, saved his estate more money than the whole of the Wren inheritance had ever amounted to, and had done it out of nothing but competence and a decency he had not deserved, and that if the county wished to be relieved by anything it might be relieved to know that the Duke of Aldemere had at last, at the age of 31, learned to tell the difference between a woman who understood the value of things and a woman who understood only the price of furs. Camilla went white and then red. She said some things that were not kind and did not need to be answered, and there was a moment, brief and almost creditable to her, when something honest showed through the practiced surface of her. When she looked at the man she had jilted a decade before and understood, perhaps for the first time, that the thing she had thrown away had grown into something she could no longer have and no longer even quite comprehended. And she said, in a smaller voice than she had used all morning, that she supposed she had never really known him at all. And in that, she was entirely right, and it was the truest sentence she spoke in that house. Then the surface closed over again, and she called for her carriage, and she went in the end back to Bath, where she found within the year a baronet of comfortable means, and forgot Aldemir entirely, which was the exact measure of comeuppance the situation required, no more and no less, for she was not a devil, only a shallow woman who had been offered a deep man's ruin and had very nearly been allowed to have it. The Duke watched her carriage go down the drive, the warm, easy carriage, and he thought of a woman who had walked. And he knew what he had to do. And he knew, too, that knowing it and doing it were separated by a distance far greater than the 4 miles she had walked in the frost, and that he would have to cross the whole of it on foot. Finding her was not difficult. Hollis had known where she was within the week, having his own quiet lines of intelligence and a loyalty that had transferred itself, without any disloyalty to his master, entirely to the mistress who had a head on her. She had gone to her father's sister in a market town 2 counties off, and had not been idle, because idleness was not in her, and had taken in hand the affairs of a failing corn factor who could not read his own accounts, and had turned him towards solvency inside 2 months. So that when the Duke came to look for his wife, he found her, in a manner of speaking, already famous in a small way among the tradesmen of a town he had never heard of, as the quiet woman who could make figures behave. But before he could go to her, the thing happened that made the going matter, the public thing, the test that the county would talk of for years. It was the winter quarter sessions, and the great business before the assembled gentlemen of the county was a scheme, pushed hard by a consortium of the larger landowners, to enclose and drain a stretch of common land, the very low ground that ran up against Aldemir's meadows, in a way that would enrich the consortium and ruin some 40 small tenants and cottagers who had grazed rights there, time out of mind. It was a technical question dressed as a legal one, all figures and surveys, and the surveys had been got up by the consortium's own men, and were. The Duke saw at a glance, using knowledge that was not his own but hers, absolute rubbish, cooked to a purpose. He could have said nothing. His own meadows stood to gain from the scheme. Every interest he had of money and of comfort and of standing well with his powerful neighbours told him to hold his peace and let the small people be crushed as small people usually are. He stood up instead. He was not a speaker. He had never in his life addressed the sessions on anything, and he stood in the crowded cold assembly room, and he took the consortium surveys apart figure by figure, exactly as she would have done, using the very knowledge of drainage and water and true cost that he had learned from her folded paper and her pencilled margins. And he showed the gentlemen of the county, who did not want to be shown, that the scheme was founded on a lie, that the ground would not drain as claimed, that the cost was understated by half and the benefit overstated by more, and that 40 families would be turned off to swell the accounts of a dozen men who did not need it. He named the fault of the surveys precisely. He did it not as a nobleman doing a kindness, which the room could have forgiven, but as a man laying facts on a table which the room could not, because there is no answering a fact. And he made powerful enemies in that hour that he would have for the rest of his life. And he knew it, and he did it anyway, and the scheme was thrown out. And afterward, when men came up to him, some angry and some quietly glad, and asked him how in the world he had come to understand drainage so thoroughly, the Duke of Aldemir said, in front of all of them, that he had learned it from his wife, and did not lower his voice when he said it, and let it be heard, so that the same county that had watched a woman kneel at his table now heard him name her his teacher in the same public rooms, which was the beginning of setting the record straight, though he knew it was only the beginning, and that the account would not be balanced by anything he said, but only, if at all, by what he did over a long time, when no one was watching. So he went to her at last, on foot, for the final mile. Having left the carriage at the edge of the town because it seemed to him that a man who had made his wife walk had no business rolling up to her door behind a pair of greys, and he stood on the step of a modest house in a modest street and knocked. And when the maid showed him in, he found the Duchess of Aldemir at a plain table in a plain room, going over a corn factor's accounts by the light of a single candle, and she looked up at him with the untroubled face he knew, and she did not rise, which told him everything about where he stood, and she said, "Your Grace," using his title like a closed door. He had prepared no speech. He had, in fact, deliberately prepared none, because he had understood at last that a fine speech was only another performance, and that he had performed at her enough for one lifetime, and so he said, standing there in his wet coat, the plainest thing he had ever said. He said that he had ordered her to wash another woman's feet in front of their friends, that he had done it not because he did not value her, but because he did, and it had frightened him, that this was not a reason but a confession, that he had learnt nothing from his father's cruelty except how to repeat it, and that he had come not to ask her to forgive him, which he had no right to ask, but only to tell her that she had been right about the meadows, and right about the shepherd, and right about him, and that the house and the estate and the man in it had all been worth less since the night she walked out of them. He did not soften any of it. He named the fault and the cause of the fault, and he declined, when a decline would have been easy, to call it anything gentler than cowardice. She listened to the whole of it without moving, her hands folded on the corn factor's ledger, and when he had finished she was quiet for a long moment, and then she spoke, in the precise, unhurried voice of a woman going through an account to see whether it balanced. She said that she believed him, which surprised him, and that believing him changed very little, which did not. She said that she had not left because of a basin of water, that she had knelt to worse things than cold water in her life and risen from them, that she had left because in the moment he gave that order she had understood that he would let her be diminished in public to spare himself the danger of being seen to care, and that a woman could build a life on very little. On cold and on work and on being unthanked she had proved as much, but that she could not build one on being a thing a man would sacrifice whenever he was afraid. Then she set out her conditions, plainly like the terms of a contract, and he understood that this was the most hopeful thing she could possibly have done. For a woman who means never to return does not trouble to say on what terms she might. She said, "You will defend my place not as a grand gesture, but ordinarily, as a matter of course, on the days no one is watching and there is nothing to be gained by it. You will not thank me for the accounts, you will simply cease to be surprised that I keep them. And you will not ask me to trust your words, which are cheap, but you will let me watch what you do over a long time, and I will draw my own conclusions, as I do with any ledger, from the entries and not from the promises at the front of the book. He said that these were fair terms. She said that they were not fair at all, that they were merely hers, and that fairness was not what she was offering. Then she asked him to go, and he went. And it was, though neither of them said so, the first honest conversation of their marriage. What followed was not dramatic, and its lack of drama was the whole of the point. For a man may perform a grand repentance in an afternoon and be his old self again by supper, and Eleanor had asked for the one thing that cannot be performed, which is consistency. He wrote to her. He did not write of love having lost the right to the word for the present, but of the estate, of the drainage begun at last on her plan, of the old shepherd kept on, and the loss called charity as she had instructed, of 100 small ordinary decisions laid before her the way one lays accounts before a partner, and she wrote back, at first only to correct his figures, which he got wrong on purpose more often than he needed to, and then, by slow degrees, of other things. The letters became the marriage they had never had. In them, freed of the terrible foot of mahogany that had always lain between them at the table, freed of the need to be seen or not seen, the two of them talked at last as the two people they actually were, and he found that he could say on paper the things his cold policy had never let him say in a room. And she found that she could allow herself to be answered, and there passed between them, over that long winter, in the guise of drainage schedules and the price of seed corn, and the health of an old man's sheep. A courtship far more real than the one they had skipped, so that when he made his small errors in the accounts on purpose, she saw exactly what he was doing, and let him do it, correcting the figure and adding once, in the margin of her reply, in the dry, private voice he had come to know from the ledgers, that a man who could take a scheme of enclosure apart before the whole quarter sessions ought to be ashamed to mistake his sevens for his nines, and that she was not deceived, and that he might come on Thursday if he liked and be wrong about the accounts in person, which was as near to tenderness as either of them had yet dared, and which he read a great many times. He came to the town, not often and never grandly, and sat at the plain table and went over the corn factor's books with her, and was useful, and did not overstay, and left the carriage at the edge of the town every time, walking the last mile in all weathers until it became a thing between them that neither named, his small penance and her small forgiveness measured out in the same currency of feet on a road. The county watched. Hollis reported the changed weather of the great house in his dry, sparing way to anyone who asked, saying only that his Grace had learned to listen, which from Hollis was as good as a psalm. Lady Augusta pronounced herself cautiously not yet disappointed, which was for her ecstasy, and the winter turned, at the slow, reluctant pace of that hard country, toward spring. It was the child who brought them the last of the way, as the child had known from the beginning that she would. Lucy fell ill in February, a fever that frightened the household, and the Duke, half mad with a fear he no longer troubled to hide, sat by her bed for 2 days, and on the second night, in the small hours, the child in her delirium asked for the Duchess, cried for her, would not be comforted by anyone else, and the Duke did the thing that his whole old self would have died rather than do, he sent a rider through the night to fetch his wife. And he did not phrase it as a summons or as a right, but as a plea, a plain naked wanting laid open on paper. Come, she is asking for you. I do not know what to do. And Eleanor came. She came at once through the cold. And she did not stand on any of her conditions when she came, because a sick child outranks a wounded pride in any decent accounting, and she sat down on the other side of the bed from the man who had wronged her. And together, over 3 long nights, they brought the little girl back through the fever. And somewhere in those nights, passing cloths and cups across the small hot form of the child they both loved, they stopped being 2 people conducting a careful correspondence and became again, or perhaps for the first time, a man and a woman in a room together who could not do without each other. Lucy woke on the 4th morning, clear-eyed and hungry and mildly outraged to find that she had missed several days. And she looked at the 2 of them sitting there, haggard and unshaven and undone with relief, and she said, with the flat certainty of the young, "You came back." And it was not a question. And Eleanor, who had told herself for 4 months that she had not decided anything, understood that she had. She returned to Aldermere in the spring, on her own terms and in her own time, and she came, at her own quiet insistence, on foot, walking up the long drive in the April sun, with the man who was learning again to be her husband walking beside her and carrying her single small case. Because she had gone out on foot, and she would come back the same way, under her own power, owing the return to no one's carriage. And the years that followed made a settled thing of it, the way years do. So that in the telling of it afterward, and it was told often at Aldermere on winter evenings, it became one of those family stories that are half legend and wholly true. The story of the Duchess, who washed the mistress's feet and then walked 4 miles in the frost sooner than ride away in his consequence. There were children in time and a great deal of work, and the low meadows drained green and sound at last, and became the best land on the estate, and were known in the family by a joke that had started as a wound as her Grace's meadows. And there grew up between the Duke and the Duchess of Aldermere a habit, a small nightly ritual that the servants knew of and never spoke of, and that the children, when they were old enough, thought the most ordinary thing in the world, and were surprised to learn that other houses did not do. For every night, whatever the day had held, when Eleanor came in from her long walking rounds of the estate she loved and had saved, tired and often cold, the Duke of Aldermere, who once had ordered his wife to her knees before another woman, knelt of his own accord before his own wife, and drew off her boots, the stout double-soled boots she still wore, and washed her tired feet with his own hands in warm water he had carried up himself, slowly, thoroughly, giving the task the whole of his attention, as a man does a thing he counts a privilege and not a penance. He never once, in all the years, explained why he did it, and she never once asked, because there are some accounts between 2 people that are best left standing open, gaining a little interest of tenderness each night. But the children learned the shape of the story eventually, as children do, and the eldest girl, who was called Augusta after the great aunt who had lived just long enough to spoil her outrageously, asked her mother once why her father washed her feet, and Eleanor looked across the warm room at the man kneeling with the basin, and she said only that once, a long time ago. She had washed feet in that house that were not her own, and had walked away from it on foot in the cold, and that everything good in her life had come of that walk, and that her father was seeing to it, one night at a time, that she never had cause to make it again.